Welcome to this virtual conversation with some of healthcare's most thoughtful leaders. And now, let the discussion begin.
Thank you for joining this conversation on behalf of State of Reform. My name is Jen Colomonaco, and I am really privileged to moderate a conversation today on gene therapy, the trends and opportunities with gene therapy generally, and how that impacts families and patients living in California who are eager, excited, maybe inquisitive about how to get access to gene therapies for often rare diseases. So we have tremendous speakers today. I will give a quick introduction and then we'll jump right into it. Anna Talaga is the U.S. Neurology Medical Director at Pfizer, working in the rare disease space. Anna is a neuroscientist by training, and she spent a decade in research labs before entering the pharmaceutical space. For the last 8 years, Anna has been working in medical affairs in neurology, immunology, rare disease, and other fields. Lots of questions for you, Anna. And Lynne Kinst is the Executive Director of the Hemophilia Council of California. Previously to that, she was the Executive Director of Central California Hemophilia Foundation and has worked for the California State Board of Equalization board members, George Runner and Diane Harkey, and as well as the taxpayer rights advocate. In addition, Lynne spent 8 years as Director of Administration with a nonprofit organization known as Capital Commission. Previously, Lynne served on both the CCHF and the HCC boards of directors. So lots of experience around a rare disease for which there are some very promising gene therapies. So that we look forward to hearing from Lynne. And then Brenda Gleason is a state health policy expert. You may have seen her on other recordings we've done for State of Reform because she really follows the nuances of state policy around coverage and access in a variety of states. She runs a firm called M2 Healthcare Consulting that she started in 2005, and she works with a wide range of healthcare organizations around issues of access and reimbursement. So with that, let me start. And Anna, let me go to you first. Talk just a little bit, kind of foundational. What is gene therapy? Why is it so important? Why are we using it for these genetic disorders and rare disorders where we're seeing a lot of innovation? So get us kind of level set at the beginning here on gene therapy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jen, and thanks for the introductions. So I think maybe I'll start back up a little bit and talk about just rare diseases. So there's between 7,000 and 10,000 rare diseases that we know about, and about 95% of those have limited or no treatment options available. And about 80% of these are actually genetic in origin, and that's why there's this big connection between gene therapy and genetic disorders. So with gene therapy, there's a potential for really long-term benefits for patients, for caregivers, health systems, and society at large. And, some of these potential impacts of gene therapy are that it can be a one-time treatment. It could reduce the need for ongoing therapies. It may reduce or even eliminate costs associated with years of chronic care management. And then in certain disease states, it can really enable the patients to live longer, healthier, more productive lives. So why genetic medicine for rare diseases? It's because a lot of these rare diseases are caused by a single genetic defect, and therefore they're amenable to gene therapies. So just to kind of give a quick background on genetic medicine approaches. So right now, there's different types of genetic medicines. There's gene therapy, and I'll go into that a little bit more. There's also gene editing. So that would be, changes of the patient's own DNA with things like CRISPR-Cas9, zinc finger, homologous recombination. And then there's another type of genetic medicine related to epigenetic modification. And that's things like oligonucleotides, microRNAs, DNA methylation, histone modification. But we're talking about gene therapy specifically. And for gene therapy, there's kind of two overarching large approaches. There's in vivo and ex vivo. So in vivo is when a viral vector carrying a therapeutic gene is administered directly into the patient's body, and there it's taken out by individual cells. So this type of gene therapy, broadly, there's a few that have been approved over the last kind of 5 years or so. Retinal disorders, for liver disorders such as hemophilia. There's also some approved for muscular disorders. And then ex vivo, the other type of kind of gene therapy is when a sample of the patient's cells are removed, like blood cells, and then there's a therapeutic gene or a viral vector of interest that's introduced. The cells are treated and they're returned to the body. So that encompasses things like CAR T therapies. So those are the kind of two differences of, two types of gene therapies. But they're both viral vector based, and it just two different delivery systems. So that's kind of, gene therapy and genetic disorders broadly.
Great. And so these are often, I can't remember if you said this, but these are often affecting children, right? And so in many cases, and so you mentioned, the benefit here, allowing people to live longer and or live better quality of life. That's really the impact that these products are having.
Yeah, about 50% of rare diseases affect children, and that's just because of their genetic nature, right? So when a child is born, they're born with these genetic diseases, and they can either be passed down or they can happen sporadically where, it just happens where there's a mutation, just occurring.
Sure. And oftentimes it takes time to figure out even what's going on, right? To get to a diagnosis. And so by the time this therapy is now even an option, I think you made the point, right? There's a lot of these diseases for which there is no treatment. All of a sudden now there's a treatment, and parents will have exhausted lots of time trying to kind of solve for what's happening. Lynne, let me turn to you. I know you have some personal experience here, and obviously working with, for a long time, hemophilia patients in different forms. This is really exciting time for, particularly for people with hemophilia, but generally for people with these diseases.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So I think one way to illustrate kind of the excitement and just the intense progress that we've made in treating some of these diseases, such as hemophilia, is sharing a little bit of my personal story. So my dad was born in 1940 with severe hemophilia B, meaning that he didn't have enough, or really almost any, of the factor IX clotting factor in his blood. And at that time, when he was born, it was actually before they even knew that there were two different types of hemophilia. It was just kind of a larger class of disease. And there were certainly no treatments that were prophylactic in nature. The only thing they could do was when a patient had a bleed, they would give them either whole blood or plasma. That was the only thing that they could do to treat for him when he was a child. And so since that time, essentially in, one person's lifetime, we've had huge advances in terms of the treatments that are available, specifically for hemophilia, but across bleeding disorders. And of course, we're seeing these advancements across rare disease more broadly as well, where we have now many different therapies available to treat patients with hemophilia. And in the last 6 months or so, we have had two new gene therapies approved, one for hemophilia A and one for hemophilia B by the FDA. So we're now looking at, while in the case of hemophilia, gene therapy wouldn't necessarily be considered a cure, it can be curative in the sense that, a successful gene therapy is going to bring the patient's clotting levels up into the normal ranges, maybe the low normal ranges, but allow them to live a very normal, active life without having to treat multiple times a week, which is currently the standard of care in most cases for patients with bleeding disorders. So it's an incredibly exciting time, but it's also a huge shift for patients and providers and the community at large in terms of how we're thinking about treatment. There are many questions still with these newly approved therapies as it relates to what is access to these therapies going to look like? How are patients going to, they're very expensive therapies. And honestly, our existing therapies are expensive as well, but these are one-time, very, very expensive costs. How are payers going to look at paying for these treatments? And what is the landscape going to look like in terms of where these treatments are being offered to patients? I know we've had some conversations around the fact that with some of the first gene therapies that emerged, most of those are administered in a hospital setting. And we know there's all kinds of, costs and, potential challenges for patients to be able to, access a center of excellence where the gene therapy is going to be administered. They may have to travel a great distance to do that, for example. But these are in the case of hemophilia treatments that potentially can be done in an outpatient setting. And so, there's the reimbursement models, and the providers are looking at just kind of a new paradigm in terms of how to deliver some of these therapies. And so there remain lots of questions about how it's all going to work. And, patients are watching to see if this is a path that they and their doctor believe is the right path forward for them and the appropriate treatment, how is that all going to work so that they're going to be able to access that treatment moving forward? And I think that in many, many respects, this isn't the first time, but, and maybe it won't be the last, that bleeding disorders and hemophilia patients are kind of at the front edge of some of these therapies, and hopefully the lessons that we learn and the sort of protocols and the policies that get put in place as a result of this will hopefully be helpful, sort of paving the way for other rare diseases, many of whom have, as was said, so many have no therapies existing right now, but there are so many exciting new opportunities in the pipeline for other rare disease that have, gene therapies and cell therapies coming. And so we want to make sure that we're involved in setting good policies that are going to ensure patients across the board are going to have access to what they need in order to improve their quality of life, and in many cases, extend their lives.
So I know we're going to talk to Brenda in a minute, really talk about how we're getting access or what's the prospect for that. Anna, maybe I'll go back to you in terms of the innovation. We talked about areas where there's no existing treatment. Now we're talking hemophilia. There is existing treatment, but it's very expensive. It's it's high risk to the patient, and it probably involves a lot of trips to the ER, and there's kind of a high total cost of care for these patients that this could potentially transform. So maybe talk about where the innovation is happening in terms of these conditions for which there's no great treatment now, and sort of what's driving that investment in innovation.
Yeah. So over the last basically 2 decades, we have made gene therapies safer, and this is by the use of adeno-associated viruses. So it's actually the gene transfer kind of technology that's been innovating really quickly. So we're using adeno-associated viruses mostly for these gene therapies for rare diseases. So those are called AAVs broadly. So there's been a lot of innovation in the AAVs themselves, making them safer. And then, kind of innovation there. And then a lot of innovation also in manufacturing. So that was a big roadblock over the course of many years, how to do large scale manufacturing of these, viruses in order to make actual commercial product viable. Before that, they were really made in a lab, so small batch, scientists at the bench. It wasn't like a real manufacturing process. So those are kind of the 2 big innovations. And then, of course, now that there's a couple of these therapies on the market, we're just learning a lot about AAVs in general. We're learning that, there's certain adverse events related to them, and we're learning how to mitigate those adverse events. So it's been really a learning and innovation process. And then really the next wave of innovation is going to be how to pay for these therapies, right? So, I think that has not caught on yet. We're still treating these gene therapies as if this is a pill that's given instead of really kind of a specialty medicine that has to be treated completely separately.
So in that light, to what extent, I guess, how quickly are you able to determine if somebody is eligible and or the product will be effective? It seems to be a big, as we think about what the outcome is likely to be and what the value of the product might be, are we able to kind of really narrow that down more because we're talking about a genetic product to be able to get it to the right person for whom it's going to have the maximum effect?
Yeah. So, we have to think about it. There's a total population with a certain genetic disease like hemophilia or spinal muscular atrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And then the kind of first thing you have to do in order to determine eligibility is see if that patient that might have, a prior exposure to the AAV, the specific AAV that they're using. So if they have say for example, we're talking about hemophilia. One of the vectors I believe that's used in one of the hemophilia AAVs is AAV8. Is that right, Lynn? Right? It's AAV8 and 5 for the two approved products. So people have antibodies against those AAVs already. It's just naturally, occurring antibodies. They're called neutralizing antibodies in our body. So you have to first test for those neutralizing antibodies. So some percentage will have those neutralizing antibodies and they can't receive that gene therapy now. You have to think about their disease progression, early versus advanced disease. You have to think about their age and comorbidities to see if they're eligible. And then in certain diseases, you also have to test specific genetic mutations. Some patients won't be eligible because of their mutations. So really you're narrowing it down in terms of gene therapy eligibility based on combinations of those factors.
Yeah, and that poses a really interesting question. Brenda, let's talk about kind of the access landscape. It seems like we're, because of, I guess, where we are in innovation in pharmaceuticals generally, where we are in this particular category of genetics and being able to, pinpoint things, it sort of raises all these interesting questions that we aren't often able to answer for other pharmaceutical products. What's the effect and who's going to have the effect, and therefore how valuable is it? How do we price it, right? So maybe talk a little bit about where the policy is on access and reimbursement kind of broadly, and then kind of what California is doing given its access landscape.
I would say I want to back up a bit, which is just to say we do actually think about the value of pharmaceuticals in pill form, but we often push that decision down to a provider. Right, in order for a drug to get approved, there has to be some proof point that quote unquote it works. So that could be, and Anna can probably talk much more about that, but I don't want to imply somehow that, right, we don't know that drugs work. We do know, and we do track them over time. And when they don't work, or they stop working, they get pulled off the market. So the gene therapy is different, mostly in that the pricing is just very different than pills. The populations are much, much, much smaller. And the way you would measure outcomes is different. So again, I think Lynne can speak very much to like, how do you measure an outcome? What counts as quote unquote working? Because of those price tags, policymakers are getting involved earlier in the process. So where it would be a negotiation between a manufacturer and a payer, maybe at the sort of 6-month mark or 12-month mark. My understanding is in gene therapies that happens at a much longer point, that it's more like an 18-month or 24 months before it comes out. Again, let's go back to why is this happening and what's important. We have patients with some sort of diseases that probably have no treatment, or treatment that maybe ameliorates some condition but doesn't cure it. So we're looking for something brand new, and the policy hasn't caught up with that. We're very comfortable with treating people in hospitals. We're very comfortable with the concept of surgery, follow-up surgery, and that being very expensive. But this concept that you could have a one-time injection or a one-time infusion or a one-time something, that's just not how the system was built. It was built to accommodate surgeons and surgery and treatment inside of hospitals. So when we're thinking about solutions and access, we really have to think about value differently, and value assessment, really putting the patient perspective foremost. If a patient could be treated at home or could do something at home or get home quicker, that should probably be considered more valuable than if we were to treat that person in a hospital, for instance. And we can talk more about value assessments and how they should be used, and how outcomes-based payment could be used. But I'll kick it back to Lynn and Anna maybe to comment on some of those other things.
Yeah, Lynn, what does an outcomes-based payment? What kind of outcomes are we talking about, and how are we able to really measure those in a way that makes that easy to administer in terms of a contract or payment?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly challenging, and we're still certainly trying to figure it out. Part of that is because, in our healthcare system in the United States, patients don't necessarily stay with the same payer for more than a year at a time, right? We have sort of year-long cycles of our employer is going to contract for our healthcare with this payer for a year. And then there's the potential that could change. People move across states, even if they potentially are, on, like, for example, in California on Medi-Cal, it's more common that folks that are in those programs stay there more consistently, but they could move across state lines, right? And so I know states, as they look at this, that's part of the feedback that we have heard from the state of California as they're looking at this idea of values-based or outcomes-based agreements. There's no guarantee that the patient is going to stay in California, and how will they track that patient if they move out of state? And also, because frankly, our government budgets really aren't built on the concept of booking savings in out years either, right? So it's all kind of contained in like what you spend and save within that one single year. And they're not necessarily looking at the, cost savings over multiple years. I think it's going to differ, and Anna can probably speak to that. It's going to differ very much depending on what type of condition is being treated. But in the case of hemophilia, there can be very clear metrics, because going into the gene therapy that there was a certain amount of prophylactic treatment that the patient was utilizing on a consistent basis that can be sort of averaged across the year prior to their treatment. And so for an outcomes-based agreement, they can look at that and they can say, okay, is the patient having to resume any sort of prophylactic treatment, which would indicate that perhaps that the therapy is not, that the gene therapy isn't working as successfully. And then over, say a 3-year period of time, 3 years out, has that patient still been able to stay off of prophylactic treatment? And I think that, part of the FDA's consideration of both of the currently approved products was looking at, the long-term efficacy over, 3-4 years. And so that's where the companies, from my understanding, are coming in suggesting that they may be willing to engage with some of these outcomes-based agreements with payers in order to, move the therapy forward in terms of patients having access. But again, from the payer side, while, at first thought, some sort of kind of warranty type of approach might seem like, oh, well, that would make payers feel better about that. There's a lot of factors to that, right? With the whole idea of how are you going to actually track that in out years? And is that payer even still providing, healthcare for that patient, 3-4 years after the initial dosing of gene therapy? So it's really interesting times to kind of figure out some of these policy issues. And again, I think what those metrics are that we're going to be able to track are going to be different depending on what's being treated. But it's part of us having to reimagine how we're going to think about health policy with some of these exciting new therapies.
And Brenda, how does that, maybe talk a little bit about California? Obviously, we know California is just between Medi-Cal and general access environment, certainly different than some other states might be. I mean, Lynne raised some interesting issues about how much of this can be a state-by-state issue versus, is there also a federal piece to this? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. No state is good at this yet. It's all very new. Actually, the leader in the country on creating these value-based agreements with pharmaceutical manufacturers is Oklahoma. Partly that is about sort of just interest, someone in the agency who is very interested in it, but some of it has to do with size, right? So California is bigger. It has more people that it's covering with rare diseases, and every single treatment, every single rare disease needs a slightly different approach. So the infrastructure that a state needs in order to actually execute an outcomes-based agreement is incredibly complicated. It takes not only internal staff, but it takes a lot of cooperation with scientists, with patients, with patient groups, with providers, in, for example, hemophilia, with hemophilia treatment centers. So there's no blueprint yet. There's no sort of, let's do it this way. And just data collection, for instance, is, again, it's not how Medicaid agencies are designed. They're not accustomed to picking up any sort of data over time from providers and patients and then monitoring it for something like outcomes. So you're talking about creating entirely new systems. I think everyone, if anyone's watching this that's California focused, they have a lot going on right now in Medi-Cal with the RX transition. So I think it's fair to say this hasn't been at the top of their to-do list. There are lots of conversations happening. I think they are working closely with manufacturers and scientists and patient groups, but they don't have any of these outcomes-based contracts in place yet. And we are all hoping, of course, if California does it and they do it well, that maybe we can copy it across the country. But California is probably looking to Oklahoma for some tips right now. No, that doesn't happen that often.
I was just going to say that doesn't often happen. So
right, but in this, there really is a great team working in other parts of the country that are hoping to get this information out to some of the bigger states.
Are there, you raise an issue of data collection, Anna or Lynne, are there disease registries? I mean, you hear sort of the disease registries play a role. Are there national registries that can create kind of a data backbone that different states can sort of tap into? Is that innovation happening?
Yeah, so there are registries that are kind of collecting long-term data from patients receiving gene therapies. Some of them, but it's a hodgepodge. That's one of the issues, right? So some are registries that are run by patient advocacy groups. Some are product registries run by the manufacturer. There's really, no kind of, right now at least, no larger like national registries from which, we we can draw data. So maybe that's another kind of innovation that needs to happen for post-approval monitoring, basically.
I know that in hemophilia specifically, we do have the Athen database that hemophilia treatment centers across the country utilize, and they've been partnering even with like the World, organization, because there has been a push and an understanding that, with this emergence of gene therapy, having even an international registry with consistent data points would be very beneficial. But to Anna's point, none of those things are, simple to create or maintain and then get all of the various people's buy-in. Athen is a pretty good data set in terms of bleeding disorders statistics, but it covers mostly just folks that are treated at hemophilia treatment centers, which is about probably 60% of our population nationally. And so you sort of have to extrapolate then from that Athen data to, okay, if it's 60%, that's probably pretty representative of the population, and then extrapolate it out to the remainder. So I don't think there's any one source that's holding all of that information right now.
So another question I sort of had was around, this is disruptive, perhaps in a very positive way for patients, but also disruptive to the systems that have been built around treating these patients. I think, Lynne, you mentioned, things that were administered in a hospital may now be able to be administered at home, right? And that might be great for the patient. It might add more value to the patients, make the product more valuable. But now it's disrupting a whole system that's been in place and with hospitals and how they're procuring the products and so forth. So there's certainly trade-offs here. And as you're thinking of the total value of the product, you have to think about all those things. So, maybe, I'm not sure if anybody wants to jump in on the question, but, how are we factoring that in? And how might that conflict with things like, I don't know, the 340B program where they're, have access to make sure that products are accessible to, populations or communities where they might not otherwise be accessible. So how do we resolve some of those conflicts in terms of these new products? Where do they kind of sit in the paradigm of how providers are providing the treatment?
So can I jump in? And then, Lynne, I'd love to hear your perspective too. I think it's really important to think about, right, these pieces have to fit together. We don't have a product if we don't have a patient, and the product can't get to the patient if we don't have a provider. So those three things have to come together. And then we have to think about what's easier for states to do and what is harder for states to do. So in the case of rare disease, Medicaid tends to cover the majority of people that have a disability that they have because they have that rare disease. So because this is all on Medicaid and because states have to balance their budgets every year, it's really hard to do certain kinds of things across states, but it's easier to do other things. So for instance, like you talked about earlier, Lynne, centers of excellence. It would be fairly easy for states to pass legislation to make it easier, for example, pediatric providers or specialists, hemophilia treatment centers, to enroll in multiple state Medicaid programs so that a person who doesn't live in their state could still access care at that center of excellence. So that's sort of moving a person to a different part of the country so they can access a provider that knows how to deliver a particular gene therapy. That's fairly simple for states to do. What's more difficult for a state to do, for instance, is like national data collection. They just don't have that sort of infrastructure to sort of build that out. So that's where you really do need the private sector and patient groups to come together, foundations, et cetera, to say, this is important, and then we'll let states sort of tap into it. I think at the provider level, so something technical like what exactly does a provider get paid when they are administering and or supplying and or providing services to a patient that needs gene therapy. We don't even have the right words yet because you're not really supplying it, right? That also will take some really thoughtful policy making around making sure providers still are able to get enough in reimbursement to continue to provide care.
Yeah, I mean, I think in hemophilia and bleeding disorders, we are absolutely seeing sort of seismic shifts in how we treat patients. And the result of that is that, all that we've been talking about here, right? So the providers then, how they're getting reimbursed for the work that they do is changing. Historically, hemophilia treatment centers have a good deal of revenue tied up into their 340B programs and how they, providing blood factor products to patients through those 340B programs. And that has funded a lot of the comprehensive care model that we have within bleeding disorders, where patients go to their hemophilia treatment center. There are, physicians, social workers, physical therapists, a variety of professionals that can provide really a comprehensive model of care to those patients. And it's one of the things that's made, the treatment of patients with bleeding disorders, pretty successful in this country for the patients that can access that. And now there's this kind of shift, and the hemophilia treatment centers are thinking about how do we ensure sustainability of our treatment centers, right? And from a patient perspective, this isn't going to, gene therapy is not going to eliminate hemophilia, right? It's going to be potentially curative to the patient who gets it. That doesn't mean that they're not going to pass it on to their children still, right? And then a new child isn't going to be born with hemophilia that's going to need to be treated. In our case, the gene therapies that we're looking at least for now, are approved for 18 and up because of their delivery mechanism, et cetera. It's not something that at least at this time, anyone's looking at putting into children. And so you still have a minimum of 18 years where a child's going to need that care, right, to even get them to the point that they would be eligible for gene therapy. And so we have to ensure that we continue to have expert providers who specialize in these fields. Not to mention, hemophilia is only one of many bleeding disorders. Von Willebrand, various other platelet disorders and factor deficiencies that these same providers have expertise in. They don't have, this new exciting gene therapy, right? We still need those providers with that expertise available to treat all of those patients as well. And, bleeding disorders is not just kind of one thing with hemophilia. And so it's something that, as we're thinking about how we're paying for these treatments, we really also have to think about how, making sure that the providers are getting reimbursed for the whole package of what they're doing, and that we're valuing the expertise that these rare disease experts bring to the patient population in the U.S. Because in many cases, without that handful of providers that has really knows this disease state, that group of patients wouldn't get any care or treatment at all, right? And so I don't know exactly how we do that, but it's a key question that we have to keep asking until we figure it out.
Well, it's an excellent point. We're changing a care continuum. We're not eliminating it. We're not saying, it's not magic. You're going to go about, not need your physicians anymore. So it really becomes even more important to consult with those providers. And how do we value the product? How does it change the care continuum? Because you're still, needing that ongoing maintenance, that ongoing monitoring. Anna mentioned some of the, some of the nuances that have to be monitored, et cetera. So it does really call for a more kind of collaborative, value-based, approach to how we're going to pay for this, and how we make sure that all the pieces in the care continuum are appropriately reimbursed. I guess maybe we'll kind of move to, any final thoughts. What are Anna, maybe I'll go back and start with you. What are you most optimistic about, maybe, and what do you really want policymakers to take away from this conversation as they wrestle with, Brenda said nobody's really doing it well yet. What's the most important thing they really need to keep in mind as they wrestle with solutions here?
Yeah, I think we're thinking too much at the state level when I think we need to be thinking about access and reimbursement at the national level. I think that, for each rare disease, as Brenda mentioned, the patient population is small. So if you're trying to do any type of innovative agreements, you're going to have to devote, in each state, time and resources and personnel for just a handful of patients. I think that hopefully some innovation will come at the federal level, not just the state level.
It's a great point. There's precedent for that too with certain conditions. So yeah, that's very interesting. Lynne, what is the biggest thing you'd like policymakers, and at any level, to really take from this conversation about the urgency with which they need to support approaches to payment and reimbursement to ensure access for these patients?
Yeah, I mean, we are always beating the drum that the patient voice has to be front and center in the conversation, right? And so policy makers need to be listening to patients, thinking about what they need, and we need to be looking at this holistically to ensure that patients have access, and again, that the providers have the resources that they need to be there to continue to treat the patients, right, over the long term. And so I think, really looking holistically at how we can ensure that patients have access. We obviously focused on the conversation about, the actual practical administration and reimbursement, but that even involves bigger things in terms of, patients being able to travel to get to where they need to be, and that there's support for their families if they're having to temporarily relocate, for example, in order to get a treatment. So it's a broad issue, and I think as much as possible, we really need to be looking at it holistically to really solve and address the problem. But ultimately, it's an exciting time, and I do think that on the positive side, the innovation is phenomenal, and the impact that this has on patients' lives is amazing, and the policy will catch up because it has to. Like, smart people will work on this, and we will figure it out because we have to figure it out in order to be able to, improve the quality of life for folks that are dealing with these issues.
Brenda, do you think how do we create that sense of urgency for policymakers, and sort of how do we cross the finish line here and get them to do what they need to do to make this work for patients?
I do think they have the sense of urgency, in part, again, from both manufacturers and patients sort of showing up and saying, I would like access to this treatment. There's something new, and we want it, right? So that part of the system's working pretty well. I do think the states in particular are very focused on how can we get access, how can we move this forward. I do think what's missing, and it is a really exciting time, the fact that, it's always so meaningful to me to hear a story like Lynne, yours and your father's. Like, this is amazing what's being created and the changes that are happening. And it is incumbent on policymakers and people like me that help policymakers think through it to put something together. For example, states are using rare disease advisory councils. California hasn't created one of those yet, but about half of states have. That is a way to sort of get people together to think systematically about what needs to change. If we could get the federal government to sort of lend a hand, that would be terrific. But in lieu of that, we could have more national cooperation or regional cooperation. That's where I think the private sector can really help sort of lend their expertise, lend money, and also lend conceptually, like, this is going to have to happen across states. So that sort of leadership, maybe making little mini pilots, or maybe hemophilia is one of the first to sort of come together and say, this is what this has to look like, again, across states. Nationally would be great, but even if we could get it, regionally, or a handful of states working together, that would start setting up some of the expectations for cross-state access, cross-state thinking, cross-state data sharing, et cetera. So I'm really looking forward to what happens next year, and how people like us and the people that are probably listening today or watching this can move this forward.
Yeah, it's a great point. There's certainly the role of policymakers, but we have national plans. We have large regional providers that transcend states. There are opportunities there to leverage that knowledge, that experience, and that motivation to solve for this in a way that that kind of respects the patients, respects the providers, but really kind of heeds the urgency and the excitement of what's possible here. So, well, I've certainly learned something from this conversation. I hope those of you who are watching this have taken something away. Thanks to Anna Talaga, Lynne Kinst, and Brenda Gleason for your insight on this really important topic around gene therapy. And thanks to State of Reform for making this conversation possible. And we certainly look forward to continuing this conversation at events across the country, as we know states and communities are going to continue to wrestle with this until we get it right. So thanks for your insight and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our sponsors, participants, and attendees for joining us in this virtual conversation, and for your support of our work at State of Reform.